Hoje, em mais um encontro do mês do impacto social, estamos com Anne Lin Goodwin, que é vice-reitora e professora da Teachers College da Universidade Columbia nos Estados Unidos e especialista em currículo, uma das maiores especialistas em currículo do mundo. E temos também Letícia Lyle ao meu lado, que é educadora, especialista em competências socioemocionais e diretora da Área de Currículo e Avaliação das Iniciativas em Educação Básica do Somos Educação. Letícia também faz parte do Lehman Fellowship, um programa da Fundação Lehman que apoia talentos comprometidos com o desenvolvimento do Brasil. O Mês do Impacto Social é uma iniciativa da Fundação Lehman em parceria com o UM BRASIL para debater questões sociais. Hoje, a nossa pauta é sobre a Base Nacional Curricular. So let's talk about the Common Core.
Let's talk about the Common Core. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's a privilege to be with you.
It is lovely to be here this morning. Thank you.
As you know, right now, Brazil is going through a process that the United States has gone through and a few other countries. We're doing this a little bit later in time, and we have a chance to do it differently and do some things that maybe could have been done better in the United States. I was a student in the States when we were implementing the Common Core, and it was very challenging as a teacher. And what we would like your input would be in how can we, since this last version is not out yet, how can we really take advantage of some of the things you know, and then maybe bring us some of that experience about implementing and communicating and teachers and all of the things that are involved in actually starting a standards movement. So what do you think?
So first of all, let me say again, it's really a pleasure to be here and a privilege to be able to speak to both of you and also to many people in Brazil. So the good news is that when you start later, you learn from the mistakes and experiences of those who have gone before. So every period, and no matter where you start, is always a good place to begin. I think it's really wonderful that Brazil is developing this Common Core and that the Common Core crosses a range of subjects, not simply mathematics and English language arts in our case, because first of all, it sends a message about the importance of multiple disciplines, not simply a focus on those two core subjects, because all subjects talk to each other and feed each other and are sort of mutually supportive. So I think that's really an important thing. I think it's also important to understand that standards are broad statements. They are large goals. They are not specific. They are designed to express a vision of what Brazil wants its students to be able to achieve and to be and to accomplish over the long term. So long term means then that implementation should also be careful and that time should be taken. If I were to identify one particular lesson from the US, is that we did not take the long time that we needed to. So standards were developed. Everyone, or almost all the states, chose to participate. It was a monumental moment in sort of the history of US education, given the fact that we are 50 states and states make their own decisions. But then we moved from that to very, very quick implementation. So curriculum were half developed. Teachers did not have enough support. Teachers were for the Common Core, but they needed to understand the standards. They needed to be able to translate those broad statements and visions into actual actions. And they also needed to understand that those actual actions might be different. Teachers know that. But I think that in the rush to implement them, things perhaps looked a little more homogeneous than they should have. And then on top of that, assessments were developed before even curriculum, instruction, and teacher knowledge were all in place. I don't think we spend enough time talking to parents to help parents understand what to expect and how a standard is very different from a specific objective. So this idea of education, the idea of spending time talking to the public, the idea of helping parents so that they in turn can help their children, I think that cannot be minimized. So if there's a way in which Brazil can think about a long-term implementation plan that ensures that things move in sequence, but that things are in place and piloted and understood before the next step is taken, I think you'll have a great process.
When we, and just a little bit more on this, but when we talk about the teacher, right, and understanding the difference between a standard and an objective and then the actual practice, maybe what do you think that we should be thinking about in that implementation process? What is the message we should be taking, or steps or processes or training, or what should we be doing, especially relating to this idea of we have a vision and then that's trickling down? And I'm saying this because that is also something that sometimes we miss in our teacher preparation.
Absolutely.
So in the initial teacher preparation and kind of the understanding of what is a curriculum and what is a learning objective and what is a scope and sequence. So
yes.
Any suggestions?
So I think that in general, whether you're talking about pre-service teachers or you're talking about teachers in service, we have spent too much time telling. We have spent too much time directing. We have spent hardly any time asking teachers. And it's not asking teachers, what do you feel like doing? It's asking teachers what you think. It's activating their ideas, because teachers, particularly those in service, they know students. They know the day-to-day work. And what we have to do is activate their thinking and engage them in a process of translating those standards. So rather than saying to teachers, here are the standards and here are ways to translate them, we should be saying to teachers, here's a vision called a standard. What would you do in your particular classroom in order to enact it? What would you do in 3rd grade? What would you do in 7th grade? What would you do with a student who is already very competent? What would you do with a student who needs some support? I think that sort of activating that, it's not just creativity, but it's really making a connection between teachers' knowledge and the broad vision and goals that standards represent. So we've also spent too much time blaming teachers. So first we tell them, and then when they're not able to perform immediately because we have not provided enough support or direction or instruction or sort of long-term engagement with ideas, then we blame them for failure and then we hop to something else. So is it possible to stay with something for a while? We have not, as a world, I think, as an education profession, we have not demonstrated that we're able to do that. And yet, if we look at the high-performing systems, that's what they do. They take their time, they stay with an idea, they move one step at a time, but they also think of a broad system. So it's not just the teacher as an individual, it's the school. It's not just the school, but it is leadership, it is the district. So I think that any implementation plan not only has to have time, but should be broad enough so that it pays attention to the kinds of structures and supports that need to be in place. And maybe they're not all in place at once, but to know that things need to be in place so that you can move towards them, I think that is even more important than, because nothing is ready-made.
You brought the subject of assessments. So still talking about our Base Comum Curricular, how do you see assessments? What are the dangers you see in that? And how should we be maybe looking at this challenge ahead?
So the first thing I would say is that we quite often use the term assessment, but we actually mean test. So there are 3 levels of assessment. One is a test, and tests are very important for understanding or having some information about whether students know a specific thing. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, if you're teaching someone to fly a plane, you definitely want to know if they know the instruments and they know the calculations. There's no sort of leeway for those. They're specific. A second level of assessment is evaluation, and the root of evaluation is value. So how do you assign a value to an assessment? That's where we get grading from. And that value comes from a set of criteria or standards that indicate goodness in an assignment. So there are certain criteria for a good essay. And according to or against those criteria, we measure a piece of work. We assign a value to it that says, oh, this is an A piece of work or a B piece of work. Also very important because not everything is discrete. But the last thing is assessment that we use so broadly. An assessment actually is about finding out what people know, whether as opposed to that they know. So this idea of digging knowledge out of students, we don't do enough of that. We certainly don't do it with teachers either. We assume that everyone needs to know. We don't stop to ask what they need to know. So that's a long preamble to say, how can we think about multiple assessments? Tests have their place. I'm not here to say that we should get rid of tests, but we have put all our eggs into the test basket. And tests only tell you one specific thing. They don't tell you the whole story. So how can we think about different kinds of measures at different kinds of times so that we can create holistic and complete pictures of children's learning? Same thing with teachers as well.
It's interesting that since there is no common core yet in Brazil, most of the schools actually work based on the assessment,
Yes.
the national assessment, which is ENEM, kind of SAT. So makes no sense.
Yes, we're already focused on the testing.
Yes. And you're not alone. Much of the world is focused on the testing. I mean, even Singapore as an example of a high-performing system, I mean, they are focused on the test as well. And the difference, I think, between a place like the US and Singapore is Singapore doesn't test every year. It doesn't test all the time. There are 3 major tests over a school child's career. Is it a good thing? They're working on it. So even Singapore is focused on being more holistic. Their latest sort of campaign is to be student-centric and values-based. They are reducing the curriculum because they are very concerned that their students are facing a world where just knowing something is not enough. You need to be able to apply. You need to be able to pull things from different disciplines. You need to problem solve, and chances are you need to problem solve with somebody else. You're not doing it alone. So in the US, we test every minute. We spend billions of dollars and thousands of hours of time that should be used more productively, testing, preparing for the test, setting up for the test. And the thing with testing is when one grade level is being tested, quite often teachers are pulled from other grade levels to proctor the tests. So that means other grade levels are doing something like watching a movie. It doesn't make sense. There's a lot of instructional time that's wasted. So this idea of having a consequential examination like you do in Brazil, like there is in Singapore, like there is in New York with the regents, again, it's not a problem in and of itself. It becomes a problem when that is the focus of schooling. We talk a great deal about 21st century skills. And the funny thing, it was already in the 21st century. We should be talking about the 22nd century skills. And I was joking with someone at a conference a couple of days ago, because he does work in 21st century skills. And I said, well, you know, they were 20th century skills, and then we didn't do them, so we pushed it to the 21st. And before that, there were 19th century skills, and we didn't do it, so we pushed it to the 20th. Collaboration, critical thinking, creativity, they span the test of time. So why are they suddenly 21st century skills? We should be asking ourselves why we haven't been able to do this in centuries. We continue to treat our students as if there is one pathway and one set of answers. And we continue to reserve that thoughtful curriculum for certain people and not others. But the bottom line is that may have worked in the 19th century. It doesn't work anymore. And I think that's why we're focused on it. We need everyone to be thinking. The world is complicated. Problems they're beyond description. You know, we have so much work to do. We need everyone to be able to do it, not just some people. So how can we talk about 21st century skills and all that, you know, collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, communication, and then we're saying, here's the test, study for the test, and once you pass the test, then we feel successful. How can we feel successful? I don't know. So there's a lot of rethinking that we need to do, a lot of discarding of sort of normative ways that we have always behaved in education. Things are hard to change, but you know, there's no time like now.
It's really interesting because you're talking about this right now, and I'm thinking in my head, you know, about, you know, those few people that ended up getting this critical thinking and communications, and you know, that has happened. So you've had people that grew up and found those skills and or were taught, and that's also one of the things that's increasing our gap.
Right.
But I also see a lot of our Board of Education secretaries, our Department of Education, a lot of people kind of focus and saying, we can't guarantee that. Like, we have to guarantee the math and the English, and that's the main thing. And so we're not going to put this in as our main standard. We're not going to put creativity and all these things there, but we're going to put them, because that's the thing that they must be able to do. And there is this feeling of like they must be able to do. There is a they and us, and it's very interesting because you're saying that, and I'm almost feeling like there is a position of fear of unleashing all of these power that creative people that maybe don't know how to calculate so well are able to do. Right. So it was, for me, it was an interesting reflection. And I think that kind of segues into our second theme and our topic, which is teacher education. And I know, as your student, how you prepare and the work that you do with pre-service teachers, and that's definitely something we need to bring more here. But as our Common Core moves closer, I'm really scared of how that's going to hit all of those teachers that are in practice, that they are in service, and that maybe are struggling with some of the concepts that they already are working on. And then we're going to bring all of these new ideas. So the discussion I'd like to bring up is on continued education, continued teaching education, and especially how you bring this to a larger group of people. What's the effective way? Is there impact in online programs? How are we going to do this? This, for me, it's the most cumbersome part of the implementation.
Right. Well, I certainly agree with you that we pay so much attention to the preparation of teachers, and yet the reality is that the average teacher is someone who's already on the job, right? And that's the case across the world. And so this idea of developing, extending, enriching the practice of teachers in service is probably one of the biggest issues facing most countries. So I'll start with sort of pre-service as a seed, but what happens in pre-service also applies to in-service, and then I'm going to talk about in-service in particular. So one thing that we do at Teachers College is we, of course, train teachers because there is training that does happen. There are particular things that one has to learn. But when we only talk about teacher learning as training, what we deny then is that teachers have agency. And that what we want to do is develop in them skills that are generative. So when you learn how to do one thing discreetly, you're able to do that one thing over and over again. But if you have a tool, a set of tools, a way of thinking that allows you to take all those things you know to invent new practices, then that's learning. And so in our pre-service programs at Teachers College, we focus a lot on learning so that we know that we're preparing teachers who may not be able to do something right away, but embedded in them are the dispositions and seeds and some of the strategies and tools that they can take into their careers. So thinking about preparing people for a lifetime of teaching, not just the first year of teaching. So things like engaging our students in collaborative groups, and not just simply putting them in groups and imagining that they'll be able to do it.
Yeah.
You know, we all know that group work is very, very hard, and collaborating is hard, and negotiating is hard, and compromising is hard, and coming to consensus is hard. So we teach them those kinds of skills. Is it something discrete? Absolutely not, but it's a set of strategies that they can take into practice. Those seeds then become sort of the way into creative practice on the in-service level. So let's move to the in-service level. The first thing that we need to do is we have to stop thinking of in-service teachers as discrete units. There's a lot of research that says teachers respond well to other teachers. In fact, they learn best from other teachers. No matter, even in the worst school, everyone can point to that one great teacher, right? At that one classroom that every parent is trying to get their child into. We need to be capitalizing on those folks to be part of the in-service development of their peers. We need to think about time. Again, and it's all fresh in my mind because I just did a presentation on this. So the sort of absorption of a new idea is not the hard part. It's the implementation of it. And if we were to stop and think for a moment, any time that any of us has learned something, you know, riding a bicycle, someone can tell you how to do it and where to sit and where to put your feet, but actually riding that bicycle takes some time and there's going to be some failure. We're going to fall down. But our expectation with teachers is we're going to tell you once, you're going to implement it with fidelity, there's no room for failure. That's not learning. So again, if we're talking about training, even training requires some time. So there's a study that says that teachers need to practice something at least 20 times before they're able to kind of own it. Personally, I think 20 times isn't enough. It depends on the complexity of the idea. There's also research that says that the amount of time that teachers need, or anyone needs, to learn something and be able to apply it is 6 months to a year. So it's not, here's a workshop and go back to your school and implement it. We have never had the patience to allow teachers to do that. But it's not just to do it on their own, and this is where that expert teacher, the senior teacher, the professional learning communities of teachers can be helpful to one another. So how can we create sort of a learning hub in every school? And so going back to the Common Core, so you have a set of Common Core standards. You present those standards to a school, and you say, you present them with a problem. The problem is, how do you implement this in your school? First thing I would do is I would do an assessment of the school, because there are bound to be things that people are doing that are already good. We focus always on what's missing, filling the gaps. We don't pay attention to what's in place. So how we kind of build on those positive practices. And then how do we go about as a community fixing addressing, extending some of the things that we need to create or improve. So teachers should be engaged in communities all the time where they are in this cycle of receiving new information, having time to practice it, engaging with other, teachers, peers, not experts, but peers, in observing and giving feedback. Lesson study is one example of that kind of practice, and then trying it again. I think that if we could do that, and in fact, again, research has shown professional learning communities, teachers improve, achievement improves. It's pretty clear. So why don't we use the strategies that have evidence behind them saying that they actually matter?
That's really interesting. When we think about Brazil, I like that when you bring the idea of teaching and learning communities, it's not necessarily something technological, right? So it's the strategy of bringing this into practice, because when we're talking about our national curriculum, we're talking about our country, and we are immense. And there are parts of Brazil where you're not going to be able to get necessarily a teaching platform to function.
Right.
So I like that you bring this aspect, which is really the relationship. I remember my first year as a classroom teacher, I had 3 teachers next to me in the same grade level, and I would run to them every minute because they had the experience and they each had their profile, and it was very good that I had that space to be able to go and ask them and learn from them. And by the end of that, it wasn't that I was a Frankenstein. I was actually my own with all the skills that I got from my teachers.
Right.
But I did learn that at my pre-service program. And then what I fear is that even our academic world is still so far from practice. And sometimes I feel that we need to bring that more, put everybody in the same pot and not necessarily have the great master and have all the students participating.
Right.
So.
There's also, some research that my colleagues and I have done around mentor teachers. And what has surprised us is that sometimes the best teacher for children is actually not the best mentor for adults. And so we're not talking about teachers that are poor, but we're not talking about the teachers who are necessarily the star teacher, because sometimes the star teacher doesn't have room and is so focused on students or children that there's no time for an adult. So we found that really good teachers actually end up being better mentors because they have more of a sense of the struggle that it might take in order to be good. So going back to what you were saying about your own experience, the reality is we always know what works. The curiosity is, why don't we do it? So again, it makes sense that there should be some kind of support from senior people when someone new enters a profession. And in many professions, that's provided. Or in many professions, it is understood that a new person is not going to perform the same way as an experienced person. But in teaching, we expect a new teacher to be just like an experienced teacher. What sense does that make? I don't understand. But anyway, so going back to this idea of induction and mentoring, if you know how to do it and you have been encouraged by your program or even your own sort of motivations to seek out help, you're more likely to be successful. If you're in a school where it doesn't happen or people close their doors, you're out of luck. So this idea of ad hoc support doesn't make sense. High-performing systems don't make it ad hoc. They make it the norm so that everyone gets that support. So I'll use Singapore again as an example because I've just come out of a huge study of Singapore for the past 2 years. 99% of people who are going into teaching, they receive mentoring and induction over the first year. It's automatic. It's assumed. It's in place. and the teachers who mentor them, they are senior teachers. It is part of a career ladder. So they don't do it in addition to their work. Their workload is reduced so that they can mentor. There is no assumption that a new teacher knows everything. And so the part of mentoring is a series of courses that every teacher, new teacher, is exposed to, offered by the senior teachers on what? Classroom management, relationships with parents and communities, assessment, engagement of students. So this idea that we certainly in the U.S. talk about it all the time, oh, your preparation program is terrible, it didn't tell you about this, everybody struggles with classroom management. You can go to the greatest preparation program and you're still going to struggle because translating something from learning to actual implementation is hard. It's just simply hard. So how can we take what we know is good practice and ensure that it applies to everyone? Same thing with children. We know what good teaching is. It happens all the time. The only problem is that it doesn't happen for everyone. We know what a good school looks like or what a well-resourced school looks like. Why don't we do it for everyone? Usually it's a matter of budgets and finance. So what does that mean? That we make decisions that, how do we decide that certain children deserve a welcoming, well-resourced school environment and other children can deal with broken down buildings and no lab equipment? So doing what we know is right is actually obviously very, very hard. But we already know the answers. We keep saying, what should we do? We should be saying, how should we do it?
So, just taking advantage of you here, one of the reasons for Brazil to move to a standards curriculum was that, and just shockingly, 3 days ago, PISA came out, and Brazil has fallen down quite a bit, and for us it's very shocking. But we are seeing how we are leaving behind a lot of people, and how maybe it's not just resources; it's the how we do it that we're missing, and deciding to do it. Right. But one of the reasons of getting standards and trying to unite the country around this and around the vision is that we can actually get closer to an equitable educational system that can bring our country, and forget about the PISA, just our country in general, to a better place. But and this, maybe it's a general question, if we can stop in this little room dream about the next steps and things that we, if we could tell the president right now and everybody that gets to decide anything, what we should do. Any insights?
And it's interesting because we're talking about the Common Core in such diverse country, which is maybe different from United States, Australia, and those countries that already have the Common Core. Like here, it's a huge country, and I think it's even more difficult.
Yes, yes. I mean, certainly it's important to acknowledge the scale that things need to happen, at which things need to happen in Brazil. And yet, regardless of scale, you have to start somewhere, right? So I think that the problem with kind of largeness is that there's an urgency, obviously, to try and cover as much ground as possible, as quickly as possible. And I can fully appreciate that because there's so much work to be done, and there's so many children who've been left behind. So I think that, and in the U.S., we are certainly not as large as Brazil, but we are very, very diverse. And we have a huge achievement gap that is associated with socioeconomics and with race. And that should not be the case at all. So the minute you see those factors, sort of being associated with poor achievement, then you know that equity is an issue. The minute you see it, you know that equity is an issue. So I guess what I've talked about a little bit and thought about just in my few days of being back in Brazil again and being reminded of the fact that we're talking about millions of children, not thousands of children, is there a way to think about some small practices or small changes that are more simple, more short-term, that can be broadly applied? Is there a way to think about levels of implementation so that there are thin short-term things, but there are deeper long-term things? Is there a way to think about some things that might be across a whole, district or state, but other things that might be in pilot schools or in small networks, to try and think in multiple terms rather than one particular strategy, so that there is movement that's happening on multiple fronts, not just one. So I think that might be important. I am a big believer in small steps and pilots and building from those, and we don't do it because of the urgency. And yet, any good researcher knows that you try things out before you go large. Even if you're having a dinner party and you're trying a recipe for the first time, you don't do it when your dinner guests are coming, right? Because the last thing you want is a disaster when everyone's sitting down at your table. What you do is you try it out yourself. So what's normal in everyday life should apply when it really matters. So you would never just kind of present, a speech. Ministers would not go and have a huge presentation without planning and some trial beforehand. So I think that if we can think about small pilots and also building networks so that educators in schools can actually be sharing and learning from each other. Particularly since Brazil is so diverse, that I think networks within regions where the conversation and the context might be a little more similar than different might help early implementation. At the same time, there should be maybe annually a big teach-in where folks come from all over to share, successes as well as challenges. Because, again, we know that you have to fall down many times before you can be successful. You write a paper, you go through 20 drafts before you get to the final. And yet each draft teaches you something. Each draft is educative in very, very important ways, and we need to share those too, because in some ways there's nothing so powerful as knowing that powerful people also struggled and were challenged, right?
True.
Yeah. So for me it's about small steps, pilots, and connecting the people who actually are going to do the work.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because Common Core will not have the final version of Common Core, right?
Right.
It's a working on progress.
Yes. Yeah.
All the time.
All the time, right. So this idea of, again, sort of building into the system opportunities for review and revision. And it should be, in some ways, everything that can be sort of planned for and structured ahead of time, knowing full well that you will be surprised all the time.
Yeah.
But if you don't plan, you'll be surprised every day, as opposed to be surprised occasionally. So this idea of thinking in holistic and comprehensive terms about what it takes in order to do something, and deliberate, regular assessment and review is very, very important to get feedback, to fine-tune. There are going to be things that seemed like a good idea at the time, great standard, and it totally was confusing, or it really was redundant, or there's something missing. Those things are going to happen. But too often what is not in place is a routine evaluation. And suddenly 10 years later, you wake up and say, oh my goodness, what did we accomplish? What do we know about what we did? And trying to do an evaluation after the fact is much more difficult, because time has passed, people have moved on, data aren't in place. So having a system in place right from the start, I think, is critical. And one last thing I'd say is just in terms of, government and ministers, as much, I'll use the word publicity, but sort of public communication that can be in place. Mm-hmm. I think that is also critical. If I look at some of, the places where, teaching is valued, or where there's a lot of innovation happening, there's a lot of transparency. There's a lot of conversation by important people about what matters. And that message becomes important for the population. So saying, we're trying this in Common Core. These are the great things that are happening. Here are examples of, amazing practices. Here are some things we're struggling with, but here's how we're addressing them. Kind of keeping that alive, not just launching it and then it kind of disappears, right? Yeah.
So I think the main message here is kind of we need to engage teachers. We need to have teachers as the part, a very important part of the process.
They have to be in the center.
Yeah,
they're the ones doing it.
Yeah. And also we need to connect Common Core to the teachers training.
Yes, absolutely. Needs to be connected to the university.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being here with us.
It is my pleasure.
And we hope the next time we will have some programs on the Common Core to debate.
Oh, I'd love to have a great conversation about that. I know that there'll be a lot to talk about.
We hope so.
Thank you.
Thank you.